All right, so when last we left our story, Madero is president, but he is beset by enemies all around him. One ambitious general who conspired to seize the presidency from Madero was Diaz's nephew, Felix Diaz. Landowners and rich people supported him, as they had Porfirio. So Diaz's attempted coup proceeds apace, and at 2 a.m. on February 9th, 1913, a column of troops with cannons moved quietly through Chapultepec Park. They were quiet, but word did reach Gustavo Madero, the savvier brother of Francisco. He was kind of the muscle behind the presidency. And he hurried to the National Palace, where he replaced the guards there who were in on the coup with his own men. So when morning broke, the rebel troops approached the Zocalo, which was full of churchgoers headed to the cathedral for church. And the men crossed the square into to the National Palace. Rifles started firing, and so did machine guns on the roof of the National Palace. After 10 minutes, the troops fled. The plaza was covered with corpses, most of them churchgoers. And what followed was the Decena Trágica, I can't say it in Spanish, the 10 tragic days, a nightmarish 10-day battle in a city of 1 million people. It was the most bloodshed in Mexico City since the Spanish conquest 400 years earlier. Felix Diaz and his troops retreated a mile away from the Zocalo to a place called the Citadel, a thick-walled building where they set up artillery and bombarded the Zocalo. Within minutes, several buildings crumbled and a dozen fires broke out. Terrified civilians ran screaming through the streets. In the National Palace, Madero made a strange decision. He gave command to Huerta and ordered him to crush the Felix Diaz uprising, much as he had Orozco. Huerta immediately lined the Zocalo with big guns and fired at the Citadel. So an artillery duel began. In the days that followed, entire neighborhoods were leveled. Families slept under mattresses to avoid splinters. Food was hard to obtain. Bodies literally littered the streets. The artillery duelists ignored the fact that tall buildings stood between them, and this meant that largely they only killed civilians huddling in their homes. Unknown to them, Huerta looked on the battle as a grand opportunity to become president. He despised Madero, had long planned to overthrow him, and he hoped the murderous cannon fire would make the people demand peace at any price. He believed that he could take over from Madero and declare peace to a weary city that would be grateful. All he needed was a go-between to negotiate with Felix Diaz, and he found that go-between in the U.S. Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson. Wilson was a corporate lawyer originally, and he was an advocate of dollar diplomacy, believed his primary mission was to advance American business interests, and he thought that Madero's talk bordered on communism and therefore was bad for American interests, and he had to go. So Wilson arranged a series of secret meetings between Felix Diaz and Huerta. Cannons continued to destroy the city. It was horrible. People huddled in the wreckage, afraid to leave. They couldn't get food. They ate dogs and cats to survive. Bodies and body parts littered the streets. Residents feared disease from the corpses, and during lulls in the fire, began to push the bodies together, douse them in gasoline, and create bonfires. It was ghastly. The 10 tragic days lasted from February 9th to February 18th, 1913. Huerta and Diaz concluded a secret pact known as the Pact of the Embassy, the American Embassy. Number one, Huerta would stop fighting, allowing the Diaz coup to succeed. 2, Huerta would proclaim himself acting president pending elections. And 3, the election would be arranged for Diaz to win, although Huerta had other plans. On February 18th, Huerta had lunch with Gustavo to sort of distract him while soldiers seized Francisco Madero and Vice President Suarez. After getting a phone call, Huerta getting a phone call telling him that this had happened, Huerta re-enters lunch with a pistol and arrested Gustavo. The shelling stopped. Henry Lane Wilson cabled Washington that Mexico has been saved. From now on, we shall have peace, progress, and prosperity. Huerta hated Gustavo even more than Francisco and handed him over to Diaz. Most of Diaz's men were bandits. They weren't soldiers. They were not disciplined. They were drunk, celebrating victory, and they beat and kicked him, gouged him with bayonets, finally shot him. When the papers published this story about Gustavo being killed so savagely, it was clear that Francisco Madero and Vice President Suarez were in danger. Dozens of foreign powers sent letters to Huerta urging him not to harm the president. and Huerta swore that he would not harm them. Huerta refused to speak to Madero's wife, who came pleading to him, and so she went to Henry Lane Wilson, showing him a pleading letter from the president's mother. Wilson replied that it was all in Huerta's hands and that he could not meddle in Mexican affairs. Late on February 22nd, an officer entered the room where Madero was being held, told him he was being transferred. He and Suarez were driven out of town, pushed out of the car, and shot. When Huerta heard the news, he was with Henry Lane Wilson at the American Embassy celebrating Washington's birthday. Washington and Lincoln's birthday used to be celebrated in February, and they're now combined into President's Day. The next morning, Huerta announced that Madero and Suarez had been killed while trying to escape. Henry Lane Wilson urged Washington to accept this explanation. Huerta assumed the presidency. He regagged the press, he jailed 110 members of Congress, and replaced federal judges with hand-picked cronies. Felix Diaz was shipped off to Japan on a diplomatic mission. Sham elections took place. Huerta was harsher than Diaz. To avoid a counter-revolution, he had 100 Madero supporters shot. Abraham Gonzalez, the governor of Chihuahua, supporter of Madero, was thrown under the wheels of a slow-moving train. A courageous congressman branded Huerta a tyrant in public and predicted his own death for saying that. And 2 weeks later, his bullet-ridden body was found in a ditch. Now, while Huerta displayed a great cunning to keep his office, he had no interest in actually running it, spending most of his time gambling, drinking cognac, and reportedly using drugs. He was constantly being chased around by bureaucrats who wanted him to sign things. Despite his shortcomings, he had his supporters. Landowners, the hacendados, clearly supported him. The American business community, who sort of Henry Lane Wilson thought he'd been supporting. The Army, which is very much Huerta's fiefdom. And the Catholic Church. And it's a good point to talk a little about the church. The Catholic Church in Mexico had a complex past. It was a force initially for good, for restraining conquistadors and protecting Indians. Then it brought the horrors of the Spanish Inquisition to Mexico, and heretics were burned alive at the stake in the Zocalo. By the 1850s, the church was the largest landowner by far in Mexico, and it dominated education. Well, it was the only source of education, and greatly influenced the government. Juarez tried to break the power of the church. This was a liberal goal, and the Civil War resulted largely from this effort. The Diaz government had reversed the government's stand, and under him the church regained much of its power. He had kind of a complex relationship with the church. Now, Madero's election had angered church leaders. He wanted to reinforce Juarez's Constitution of 1857, which called for separation of church and state. The church had hated that. Huerta, however, ignored the Constitution of 1857, just as Diaz had. Priests, therefore, held special masses celebrating Huerta's presidency. The church, therefore, became a villain in the eyes of the Mexican revolutionaries. They were anti-clerical, meaning anti-priest, anti-church. They were not, however, anti-religion. Villa very famously said, quote, "I believe in God, but not religion." This sums up the revolutionary attitude toward the church. Now, by killing Madero, Huerta made him a martyr. Even generals and politicians who had thought Madero an incompetent president now called for a revolution to avenge him. One of the men intent on deposing Huerta was the governor of Coahuila, Venustiano Carranza. He was an unlikely revolutionary. He was white, European descent, rich. He enjoyed elegant food and clothing. He was a Madero supporter, and he refused to accept Huerta as president. He announced the Plan of Guadalupe, calling for the overthrow of Huerta and a return to the Constitution of 1857. He gathered an army and labeled himself the first chief of the revolution. Now, northern Mexico was different than the rest of the nation. It was arid, tough, and independent. It bred tough, independent men like Villa, Carranza, and ultimately the most successful leader of the revolution, Alvaro Obregón. Obregón was also of European descent, but unlike Carranza, he was not born to wealth. He worked as a farmer, a factory mechanic, a school teacher. He was kind of a jack of all trades, and he was therefore sort of part of the emerging middle class. He lived among the Yaquis of Sonora and witnessed their mistreatment in the Porfiriato. He was Madero's supporter, and he became a revolutionary after his assassination. At first, his army was composed mostly of Yaquis, armed only with bows and arrows, but they fought with incredible fury. Huerta soon found himself surrounded. Zapata's Hacienda War continued in the south. In the north were Obregón and his Yaquis, Villa and his army of unemployed mestizo mine workers. In the northwest were Carranza and his cavalry army. The armies of the north bought weapons from the U.S. Arms dealers with money from cattle rustling and ransom from hacienda owners. Villa, Obregón, and Carranza operated independently but had some common goals, and Carranza sort of nominally considered himself their chief, but Obregón and Villa especially were somewhat independent, but they had common goals. They were all anti-clerical, anti-church. They wanted Huerta out, and they wanted to reestablish the Constitution of 1857. So they became known, particularly Carranza, as the Constitutionalist, and they had a common slogan, Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty. Now, Huerta mustered his own army from the men of Mexico City, the only area he fully controlled. All males between 15 and 40 were obliged to serve. People were afraid to walk the streets lest they be recruited. Using strong-arm tactics, Huerta built an army of 200,000, 4 times the old federal army, although they weren't very enthusiastic or well-trained. And by 1913, by the end of 1913, virtually everyone was swept up in the revolution. Lawyers, doctors, and college students fought alongside barefoot campesinos. Now, U.S. leaders watched Mexico with growing concern. Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated shortly after Madero's assassination. He rejected dollar diplomacy. He is, of course, an idealist in international affairs, and he had become an admirer of Madero. He recalled Henry Lane Wilson, suspected he gave poor reports to Taft, but Wilson was still suspect, like most Americans, of Latin Americans, and he believed that Latin American people needed guidance from their more sophisticated neighbors. "I'm going to teach the South American republics how to elect good men," he had said. He sent a representative, John Lind of Minnesota, to investigate the turmoil in Mexico, and Lind reported that usurpations like Huerta's menaced U.S. peace and prosperity. So Wilson allowed arms dealers to sell to the Constitutionalists, but forbade sales to Huerta. When this arms embargo failed to break Huerta's grip, he more or less sought an excuse to invade Mexico. In the Gulf of Mexico port of Tampico, an American warship docked to take on supplies, and a small group of sailors wandered by mistake into a restricted area. They were arrested. They were released after several hours, and the Tampico chief of police apologized to the captain of the ship for the mistake. The captain refused to accept the apology and asked for a 21-gun salute to show the Mexicans respected the American flag. The chief of police refused. This heightened tensions, and Wilson sends a fleet into the Gulf. And when the U.S. learned through spies that a German ship was carrying machine guns for Huerta, Wilson ordered the fleet to occupy Veracruz to stop this ship. And so the occupation began April 2nd, 1914. The Marines landed, took control of the docks. By the afternoon, cadets of the Mexican Naval Academy had decided to defend Mexico. They attacked the Marines, and a gunfight broke out. The Marines were supported by the warships, and when the fight ended, 300 Mexicans lay dead, mostly civilians, and American casualties were slight. Now, in Mexico City, Huerta was furious, although he could do nothing about this. He threatened to invade Texas, storm across the South, and arm black people in revolution. This was obviously an empty threat, but the occupation of Veracruz did somewhat legitimize Huerta. Even Mexicans who hated him rallied behind him on this issue in opposition to the invasion. Mexicans are very sensitive about this invasion by the gringos. And during the 7-month occupation of Veracruz, people in Mexico City broke windows of American businesses. They toppled a statue of George Washington. Still, this unity against the U.S. would not save Huerta.